We live immersed in economic narratives that shape our perception of reality, often in ways as subtle as they are inescapable. We are bombarded daily with aggregate statistics, macroeconomic forecasts, and justifications for government interventions that promise stability, growth, and social justice. However, beneath the surface of these polished narratives lies a latent distrust, an uneasy feeling that the pieces don't fit, that promises rarely materialize as advertised, and that, perhaps, we are being systematically misled about the fundamental nature of the economic and social processes that govern our lives. What if there were a key, a framework of thought capable not only of identifying the cracks in this edifice of apparent consensus but of exposing its flawed foundations? What if this key lay in an intellectual tradition frequently marginalized, seen by many as anachronistic or too radical for mainstream debate? The Austrian school of economics, with its roots in late 19th and early 20th century Vienna, proposes exactly that, a fundamental reorientation of economic analysis, starting from the individual and their purposeful action as the epicenter of all economic activity. Far from being a mere set of alternative theories, the Austrian perspective offers a radically different worldview, one that challenges established dogmas about the role of the state, the nature of money, the origin of crises, and, crucially, about how information and knowledge are dispersed, or obstructed, in society. Questioning the status quo is not just an intellectual exercise, it becomes a pressing necessity when the consequences of dominant policies manifest in cycles of artificial expansion and painful collapse, in the erosion of purchasing power, and in the growing sense of precariousness that haunts even so-called developed economies. The Austrian proposal is not to offer easy solutions or unachievable utopias but to provide the conceptual tools to decipher the complex tapestry of human interaction, revealing the often hidden mechanisms by which well-intentioned interventions can generate perverse results and how the pursuit of centralized control inevitably clashes with the decentralized and subjective nature of human knowledge. Is the feeling of being deceived merely paranoia, or is there a systemic logic, explained by this school of thought, that makes certain forms of economic illusion almost inevitable in the current paradigm? The journey to understanding the Austrian perspective begins with one of its most distinctive and controversial pillars, methodological individualism, in direct contrast to approaches that treat aggregates like the economy, the market, or society as monolithic entities with a will of their own. Austrians insist that all meaningful economic analysis must begin and end with the acting individual. This is not to deny the existence of groups or institutions but to affirm that these social phenomena are the result, often unintentional, of the actions and interactions of individuals with their own plans, values, and expectations. This shift in focus is not trivial. It dismantles the very basis upon which many interventionist policies are built. When a government claims to stimulate the economy through public spending or manipulation of interest rates, the Austrian lens forces us to ask, which specific individuals are being benefited? Which individual plans are being favored at the expense of others? Which market signals are being distorted by this centralized action? By disaggregating the collective, methodological individualism reveals the underlying complexity and heterogeneity, exposing the illusion that a central planner can optimize social welfare without violating the preferences and projects of countless individuals. This approach sheds light on how seemingly universal policies, in fact, create specific winners and losers, often in ways not obvious at first glance. Inflation, for example, is not just a general increase in prices, it is a process of wealth redistribution from those who receive the new money last, wage earners, pensioners, to those who receive it first, government, banks, large connected corporations. The veil of the aggregate is torn away, exposing the reality of human action and its distributive consequences. Closely linked to methodological individualism is the concept of subjectivism, another cornerstone of Austrian thought that radically differentiates it from the neoclassical and Keynesian schools. While the latter often treat value, costs, and utility as objective and measurable quantities, Austrians, following the tradition of Karl Menger, emphasize that value does not reside in the intrinsic properties of goods or the costs of production but in the minds of the individuals who evaluate these goods in relation to the satisfaction of their needs and desires. Value is subjective, contextual, and marginal. A glass of water can have immense value to someone lost in the desert but almost none to someone next to a spring. Similarly, Costs are not just monetary outlays but represent the value of the best. Alternative sacrificed, opportunity cost, an inherently subjective and prospective evaluation. This understanding has profound implications. If value is subjective, then attempts to calculate or impose a fair price or a fair wage by decree are fundamentally flawed, as they ignore the individual evaluations that form the basis of any voluntary exchange. More crucially, subjectivism undermines the very possibility of rational economic calculation under socialism or any form of comprehensive central planning, as argued by Ludwig von Mises in his famous essay on economic calculation. Without private ownership of the means of production and the free formation of prices in competitive markets, there is no way to discover the relative values of capital goods, and therefore, there is no way to allocate resources efficiently to satisfy the most urgent needs of consumers. The central planner, no matter how well-intentioned or powerful, is blind, operating in a vacuum of information that only the market process, driven by millions of subjective evaluations, can fill. This blindness is not accidental, it is an inevitable consequence of the attempt to replace the spontaneous order of the market with the deliberate order of planning. The interaction of these principles, methodological individualism and subjectivism, culminates in the Austrian understanding of the market as a dynamic process of discovery and coordination. Far from being a state of static equilibrium, as often modeled in neoclassical economics, the market is seen as an arena of constant flux, learning, and adaptation, driven by the central figure of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur, in the Austrian view, particularly that of Israel Kirzner, is the individual, alert to profit opportunities not yet perceived by others, price discrepancies, new technologies, unmet needs. By acting on these opportunities, the entrepreneur not only seeks their own gain but, crucially, tends to correct imbalances, to reallocate resources from less valued uses to more valued uses, and to disseminate information through the price system. Prices, in this context, are not mere labels, they are vital signals that condense dispersed information about relative scarcity, consumer preferences, and production opportunities. They guide the decisions of producers and consumers, coordinating independent plans in a way that no central planner could replicate. The beauty and complexity of this process lie in its spontaneous and decentralized nature. Order emerges not from conscious design but from the voluntary interactions of individuals, seeking their own ends, guided by price signals and the entrepreneurial pursuit of profit. Any intervention that distorts these signals, such as price controls, subsidies, or, more fundamentally, the manipulation of the money supply, not only impedes efficiency but actively discoordinates economic activity, leading to malinvestments and, eventually, to crises. It is here that the feeling of being deceived begins to take concrete form. The very tools that supposedly stabilize the economy may, in fact, be the main sources of its instability. We now enter the heart of the Austrian explanation for economic crises, particularly the cycles of expansion and recession. The Austrian business cycle theory, ABCT, developed primarily by Mises and elaborated by Friedrich Hayek, who received the Nobel Prize in part for this work. The ABCT argues that business cycles are not inherent features of free market capitalism but rather direct consequences of government intervention in the monetary system, specifically through the artificial expansion of credit by a central bank. When the central bank, seeking to stimulate the economy or finance government deficits, injects new money into the banking system, usually by buying government bonds or reducing the discount rate, it pushes interest rates down, below the level that would prevail in a free market, the natural rate of interest, which reflects individuals' time preferences, their willingness to save versus consume. This artificially low interest rate sends a misleading signal to entrepreneurs. They interpret the fall in interest rates as a sign that more real savings are available in the economy, indicating that consumers are willing to postpone present consumption in favor of more future consumption. This encourages them to initiate long-term investment projects, especially in capital goods, machines, factories, infrastructure, the higher stages of the production structure. A boom ensues, a seemingly robust economic expansion, with increased employment and widespread optimism. However, this expansion is unsustainable. The low interest rate did not reflect a genuine increase in savings but rather a creation of credit out of thin air. Consumers did not alter their time preferences, they still wish to consume goods in the present in the same proportion as before. As the new money spreads through the economy and wages increase, the demand for consumer goods begins to strain resources, which have been diverted to long-term investment projects. The prices of consumer goods and factors of production, raw materials, labor, begin to rise, revealing that there was not enough real saving to sustain all the investments initiated. The long-term projects, which seemed profitable with the artificially low interest rate, now prove to be unviable. The bust occurs, the recession. Companies fail, projects are abandoned, unemployment rises. The recession, in the Austrian view, is not the problem itself but rather the necessary and painful process of correcting the misallocations made during the artificial boom. It is the liquidation of bad investments and the reallocation of resources back to uses that are in line with the real preferences of consumers and the real availability of savings. The ABCT, therefore, identifies the central bank in its expansionary monetary policy as the main culprit behind business cycles, transforming what is presented as a tool of stabilization into the very engine of instability and systemic economic deception. Deepening the analysis of the ABCT, we realize that it is not just a theory about aggregate fluctuations but a micro-founded explanation about the discoordination of the capital structure. The metaphor often used is that of a builder who receives a project for a tall building, based on the premise that enough bricks are available. He begins to build the upper floors, but midway through, he discovers that the promised bricks do not exist. He will have to demolish part of the structure already erected. The expansion of credit works in an analogous way. It encourages the lengthening of the production structure, investments in longer and more complex processes, but without the corresponding increase in real savings, the bricks necessary to complete it. The deception here is twofold. First, entrepreneurs are deceived by distorted price signals, the interest rate, into making investment decisions that will prove unsustainable. Second, the general public is deceived by the apparent prosperity of the boom, without realizing that it is being built on a foundation of monetary quicksand. The inflation of asset prices, stocks, real estate, that often accompanies the boom creates an illusion of wealth, while the inflation of consumer prices silent erodes purchasing power. When the inevitable correction arrives, the blame is often attributed to the greed of entrepreneurs, the irrational exuberance of the market, or external shocks, diverting attention from the root cause, the monetary policy of the central bank. This convenient narrative serves to justify even more interventions, perpetuating the cycle. The ABCT, in contrast, offers a coherent causal explanation, rooted in human action and the logic of economic coordination, which exposes monetary intervention not as a solution but as the origin of the problem. Understanding this mechanism is crucial to decipher why crises seem to arise out of nowhere and why the proposed solutions often only prepare the ground for the next crisis. Let us now dissect one of the most pernicious hidden mechanisms that sustain this cycle of deception: inflation as a form of silent taxation and economic discoordination. Officially, inflation is often presented as a natural phenomenon, perhaps a necessary evil to grease the wheels of the economy, or to avoid deflation, supposedly more dangerous. Inflation targets of 2% per year are common among central banks, sold as synonymous with price stability. The Austrian perspective, however, reveals a much darker reality. Inflation, defined correctly not as the increase in prices, which is its consequence, but as the increase in the supply of money and credit, is fundamentally an act of intervention that distorts the economic structure and redistributes wealth, coercively and non-transparently. When the central bank or the fractional reserve banking system creates new money, it does not enter the economy in a neutral and uniform way. The so-called helicopter money is an unrealistic abstraction. It is injected at specific points, usually through loans to banks, the purchase of public debt, or direct financing of government spending. The first to receive this new money: government, banks, large contractors. The financial sector can spend it before general prices have risen significantly. They benefit from an increase in their purchasing power. As this money circulates through the economy, it raises the demand for goods and services, causing prices to rise. Those who receive the money last, salaried workers with long-term contracts, pensioners, small savers, find that their purchasing power has decreased their income and savings by less than before. This is the Cantillon effect, described by the Franco-Irish economist Richard Cantillon. In the 18th century and central to Austrian analysis, inflation is not a uniform increase. It is a sequential process that systematically benefits those closest to the monetary spigot at the expense of those further away. It is a form of regressive taxation, operating silently, without the need for explicit legislation, eroding the savings and living standards of the majority of the population to finance the state and its allies. The 2% target is not stability. It is a slow but constant expropriation. Beyond redistribution, inflation impairs economic calculation. Relative prices become confused, making it difficult for entrepreneurs to distinguish real changes in demand or scarcity from mere monetary noise. Malinvestments become more likely, undermining long-term efficiency and productivity. Inflation encourages indebtedness, since the debt will be paid with devalued money, and discourages saving, distorting time preferences and harming capital formation, which is the basis of sustainable economic growth. Presented as a lubricant, inflation functions more like sand in the gears of economic coordination. Its persistence as a deliberate policy, despite these devastating consequences, can only be understood as a mechanism for state financing and the favoring of specific interest groups, masked by a rhetoric of stability and general well-being. The second hidden mechanism, intrinsically linked to inflation, is the role of the central bank as a monetary central planner and driver of business cycles. The very existence of a monopolistic institution with the power to create fiat money, not backed by commodities like gold or silver, and to manipulate the interest rate is, for Austrians, a historical anomaly and a fundamental source of instability. The official narrative justifies central banks as necessary to ensure financial stability, control inflation, and act as lender of last resort. However, the Austrian analysis, particularly the ABCT, inverts this logic. It is the actions of the central bank that generate the instability it supposedly combats. By attempting to manage the economy through monetary policy, the central bank inevitably makes mistakes, as it suffers from the same knowledge problem that afflicts any central planner. No committee, no matter how intelligent or well-informed, can possess the dispersed and tacit knowledge necessary to determine the correct interest rate or the optimal quantity of money. The free market interest rate is a crucial price that coordinates saving and investment decisions over time. Fixing it by decree is like trying to fix the price of bread. It leads to imbalances and misallocation. The expansion of credit, as we have seen, generates the artificial boom and the subsequent corrective recession. Furthermore, the function of lender of last resort creates a moral hazard problem. Knowing that they will be bailed out in case of difficulty, financial institutions have an incentive to take excessive risks, planting the seeds of future financial crises. The bailouts that follow these crises socialize the losses, while the profits were privatized. During the boom, reinforcing the perception of a system manipulated in favor of the financial and political elites. The history of central banks, from the Bank of England to the American Federal Reserve, is replete with episodes of monetary expansions that led to speculative bubbles and financial collapses, followed by more interventions and concentration of power. Far from being a neutral guardian of stability, the central bank acts as a cartelizer of the banking sector, a facilitator of government indebtedness, and the main instrument through which the illusion of prosperity sustained by debt and inflation is perpetuated. Its abolition or, at a minimum, the introduction of monetary competition, such as Hayek's proposal for the denationalization of money, is seen by many Austrians as a prerequisite for a truly stable and free economic order. A third mechanism of systemic deception, often underestimated, is government regulation, especially when presented under the guise of consumer protection, safety, or social justice. Although some regulations may have plausible justifications, the Austrian perspective, particularly that of the public choice school, which shares many premises with the Austrian, warns of the perverse incentives and unintended consequences that often dominate the regulatory process. Far from being a neutral arbiter seeking the public interest, the regulatory state is a battleground for organized interest groups, lobbies, that seek to use the coercive power of the government to obtain competitive advantages, create barriers to entry for new competitors, and socialize their costs. Large established companies often support complex and onerous regulations, not because they genuinely care about the public good, but because they know they can bear the costs of compliance more easily than their smaller competitors or potential entrants. Regulation becomes a tool of cartelization, solidifying market positions and reducing the competitive pressure that would normally benefit consumers with lower prices and greater innovation. Consider the occupational licenses required for a vast array of professions, from hairdressers to interior decorators. Although justified in the name of quality and safety, they often serve primarily to limit the number of practitioners, raise prices, and protect insiders. Environmental regulations, however well-intentioned, can impose disproportionate costs on small businesses, while large corporations may even profit from carbon credits or subsidies for green technologies. Complex financial regulations, such as those implemented after the 2008 crisis, Dodd-Frank in the US, although sold as a way to prevent future crises, ended up consolidating the power of large, too big to fail banks and making life difficult for smaller community banks. The deception lies in the narrative. Regulation is presented as a solution to market failures, when often it is a consequence of the capture of the state by private interests or an attempt to correct problems caused by previous interventions, such as the financial crisis itself, exacerbated by loose monetary policy and implicit subsidies to the real estate sector. The Austrian and public choice analysis invites us to look beyond the official justifications and investigate who really benefits and who pays the costs of the regulatory machine, revealing how it can become a powerful instrument for entrenching privileges and stifling the entrepreneurial dynamics that drive genuine progress. The complexity and opacity of the regulatory apparatus also serve to obscure responsibility, making it difficult for the common citizen to understand why certain sectors seem immune to competition or why the prices of certain services continue to rise despite technological advances. The fourth mechanism, more philosophical but with immense practical implications, is the persistence of the knowledge problem, identified by Hayek. The essence of the argument is that the knowledge relevant to economic coordination is not scientific or technical, capable of being concentrated in a single mind or committee, but rather knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place, dispersed among millions of individuals and often tacit, difficult to articulate or formalize. Each consumer knows their own preferences and priorities. Each entrepreneur knows the specific conditions of their local market, the capabilities of their employees, the immediate opportunities that arise. No central planner can aggregate or process this vast amount of decentralized information effectively. The price system of a free market functions as an extraordinarily efficient communication mechanism, transmitting information about relative scarcity and preferences in a concise and actionable way, allowing individuals to coordinate their plans without needing to know all the underlying details. The attempt to replace this spontaneous process with deliberate planning is doomed to fail, not for lack of will or computational power, but by the very nature of the knowledge required. The deception here lies in the pretense of knowledge. The expression is Hayek's, the intellectual arrogance of believing that central planners can know more about people's needs and capabilities than they themselves, and that they can direct society towards optimal outcomes through calculated interventions. This pretense permeates not only explicit economic planning, as in classical socialism, but also the more subtle forms of social engineering and macroeconomic management prevalent in Western democracies. Policies that aim to create jobs, direct investments to strategic sectors, or stabilize prices ignore the complexity and decentralized nature of the economic order. They assume a level of knowledge and control that simply does not exist. The consequences are, at best, inefficiency and waste, at worst, discoordination, crises, and the erosion of individual liberty, as people's choices are replaced by the dictates of planners. The dominant narrative, however, rarely questions the fundamental premise that such planning is possible or desirable. Failure is attributed to details of implementation, lack of data, or political ill will, never to the inherent impossibility of the task. Recognizing the insurmountable limits of centralized knowledge is a crucial step in unmasking the futility and dangers of social and economic engineering, and in reaffirming the superiority of the spontaneous order of the market and civil society in solving complex problems. A fifth mechanism, operating at the cultural and ideological level, is the manipulation of public perception through educational systems and media narratives that promote a statist and interventionist view of the economy and society. From an early age, school curricula often present the market as inherently chaotic, exploitative, and prone to crises, while the state is portrayed as the necessary agent to correct these failures, ensure justice, and promote the common good. Economic history is often told in a way that emphasizes market failures, often caused by previous interventions, and glorifies government actions, such as the New Deal or social welfare programs, rarely presenting a critical analysis of the costs, unintended consequences, or free market alternatives. Fundamental Austrian concepts such as spontaneous order, the importance of entrepreneurship, or the ABCT are generally ignored or caricatured. The media, in turn, tend to focus on the immediate symptoms of economic problems. Unemployment, price inflation, and give voice predominantly to economists and commentators who advocate interventionist solutions, more spending, more regulation, more monetary control. The underlying causes, especially those related to government policy, are often obscured or minimized. The very language used shapes perception, government, investment, even if it is unproductive spending, economic stimulus, even if it is artificial credit expansion, regulatory protection, even if it is a barrier to entry. This linguistic framing creates a bias in favor of intervention and makes it difficult for the public to question the basic premises of the proposed policies. Furthermore, the reliance on aggregate statistics, GDP, official unemployment rate, consumer price index, provided by the government itself creates an illusion of objectivity and control, masking the microeconomic complexity and individual experiences that may diverge significantly from these averages. The result is a cultural environment where the ideas of economic freedom, limited government, and individual responsibility are often viewed with suspicion, while dependence on the state and faith in the ability of experts to manage society are considered the norm. Dismantling this mechanism requires a conscious effort of alternative education, promoting critical thinking, exposing the fallacies of the dominant narratives, and rescuing the intellectual traditions, such as the Austrian school, that offer a more realistic and liberating understanding of human interaction. Finally, a sixth hidden mechanism, perhaps the most insidious, is the way the current system undermines individual and collective autonomy, disguising itself as inevitable, or even natural. The constant erosion of purchasing power through inflation, the growing tax burden, explicit and implicit, to finance an ever larger state, the complex web of regulations that stifle private initiative, and the dependence created by social welfare programs, all of this contributes to reducing the scope of individual action, and the capacity of communities to self-organize. People become more dependent on the state for their economic security, health, and education, gradually losing the skills and networks of mutual support that characterized freer societies. This dependence generates a vicious cycle. The more people depend on the state, the more they tend to support interventionist policies that promise more benefits, even if these policies, in the long run, further undermine prosperity and autonomy. The very structure of the financial system based on fiat money and easy credit encourages immediate consumption and indebtedness, to the detriment of saving, retirement planning, and long-term investment, which are fundamental to individual financial independence and capital formation in society. The feeling of powerlessness in the face of apparently uncontrollable economic forces, such as inflation or cyclical unemployment, leads many to accept the status quo as inevitable, without realizing that these forces are, to a large extent, the result of deliberate policies. The narrative that there is no alternative, Tina, popularized in certain political circles, serves to paralyze the imagination and discourage the search for solutions outside the interventionist paradigm. The Austrian school, in contrast, by emphasizing the primacy of individual action, the importance of private property, freedom of exchange, and sound money, offers a powerful alternative vision. It shows that prosperity and social order do not depend on central planning but emerge from freedom and individual responsibility. It exposes how systematic intervention creates dependence and undermines autonomy, and points to a path of restoring freedom through limiting the power of the state, monetary reform, and strengthening the institutions of civil society. Recognizing that the current system is not natural or inevitable but rather the product of specific political and institutional choices is the first step towards recovering individual and collective agency and building a freer and more prosperous society. The unexpected connection here can be made with biology, just as a complex ecosystem thrives through the diversity and spontaneous interaction of its components. A free society flourishes through the diversity of individual plans and the decentralized coordination facilitated by sound institutions, property, contracts, honest money. The attempt to impose centralized control is as harmful to an economy as the attempt by an ecosystem planner to control every interaction between species would be. Having dissected these mechanisms of deception and discoordination, the pressing question becomes, how can we dismantle their effects and navigate a world shaped by them? The Austrian perspective does not offer a centralized plan of action, as this would contradict its own principles. Instead, it points to strategies that operate on multiple levels, beginning with the individual. The first step is economic education, understanding the fundamental principles of human action, subjectivism, the market process, and, crucially, the monetary theory and business cycles. Armed with this knowledge, the individual can critically interpret the dominant narratives, identify the misleading signals, such as artificially low interest rates or promises of prosperity based on debt, and make more informed decisions about their own finances, career, and investments. This may involve seeking assets that preserve value in the face of inflation, historically precious metals like gold and silver, more recently, some argue, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, although there is debate within the Austrian school itself about this, reducing dependence on debt, developing valuable skills, and building financial resilience. Frugality and saving, virtues often ridiculed in a consumer culture driven by easy credit, regain their central place as the foundation of economic security and independence. The understanding of methodological individualism also leads to a healthy skepticism towards collectivist solutions and an appreciation of personal responsibility and private initiative. At the community and social level, the Austrian understanding encourages the strengthening of the institutions of civil society that operate outside the direct control of the state. This includes mutual aid networks, voluntary associations, local markets, and independent educational initiatives. The more people can satisfy their needs through voluntary cooperation and peaceful exchange, the less they will depend on state structures and the less vulnerable they will be to their manipulations and inefficiencies. The defense of private property and freedom of contract becomes crucial, not only as abstract principles but as practical foundations for building resilient and self-sufficient communities. Entrepreneurship, seen as the engine of the market's discovery and adaptation process, must be celebrated and unimpeded, removing regulatory and tax barriers that stifle it. The creation of alternative or complementary monetary systems, based on principles of soundness and decentralization, can also be seen as a long-term strategy to undermine the state monopoly on money, although it faces significant legal and practical obstacles. The key is to foster a culture that values individual liberty, personal responsibility, and spontaneous order, in contrast to the culture of dependence, central planning, and social engineering. This requires an open and continuous dialogue, challenging interventionist premises and presenting the alternatives based on freedom in a clear and persuasive manner. Finally, at the political and institutional level, the Austrian perspective advocates radical reforms that limit the power and scope of the state, especially in economic and monetary matters. The most fundamental proposal is the complete separation of money and state, whether through a return to a gold standard, the permission for competition of private currencies, free banking, or the adoption of new decentralized monetary technologies. The goal is to remove from the hands of politicians and bureaucrats the ability to manipulate the supply of money and credit, thus eliminating the root cause of business cycles and chronic inflation. In parallel, it advocates for comprehensive deregulation, eliminating laws and agencies that create barriers to entry, protect vested interests, and distort market signals. Taxation should be drastically reduced, allowing individuals to retain more of the fruits of their labor and investments, encouraging saving and capital formation. Government spending should be cut, limiting the state to its essential functions of protecting individual rights, life, liberty, and property, and enforcing contracts. This agenda, known generically as classical liberalism or libertarianism, is seen not as a utopia but as the institutional framework most compatible with human nature and most conducive to peace, prosperity, and social cooperation. The implementation of such reforms faces enormous political challenges, given the strength of the entrenched interests that benefit from the interventionist status quo. However, the clear understanding of Austrian principles and the dissemination of these ideas are considered essential prerequisites for any significant change in the direction of a freer and more honest society. The struggle is not only economic but fundamentally intellectual and moral. In summary, the Austrian School of Economics offers much more than an alternative set of analytical tools. It provides a radical reinterpretation of social and economic reality, one that profoundly challenges conventional narratives and exposes the often hidden mechanisms by which individuals can be systematically deceived and dispossessed. By starting from individual human action and subjective value, it reveals the complexity and spontaneous nature of the market order, highlighting the crucial importance of free prices and private property as mechanisms of coordination and calculation. Its theory of business cycles identifies the monetary intervention of the central bank as the fundamental cause of the devastating fluctuations between unsustainable expansions and painful recessions, unmasking inflation as a form of silent taxation and coercive redistribution. The Austrian analysis extends to the critique of government regulation as often captured by special interests and the denunciation of the pretense of knowledge that underlies all forms of central planning and social engineering. It warns us about how cultural and educational narratives can perpetuate interventionist biases and how the system itself can undermine individual autonomy, creating dependence and obscuring responsibility. The feeling of being deceived ceases to be a mere suspicion and comes to be understood as a logical consequence of an institutional system that distorts signals, obscures costs and benefits, and concentrates power in the hands of a few. However, the final message of the Austrian school is not one of despair but of enlightenment and empowerment. By providing the intellectual tools to decipher the complexity of the real world and identify the sources of deception, it paves the way for informed individual and collective action. The pursuit of economic education, the strengthening of the institutions of civil society, the defense of economic freedom, and the struggle for institutional reforms that limit the power of the state and restore monetary soundness emerge as practical paths to challenge the status quo and build a future where honesty, freedom, and prosperity can flourish, not despite human nature, but in harmony with it. The journey to unravel the layers of illusion may be arduous, but the rewards, intellectual clarity, greater personal autonomy, and the possibility of a more just and peaceful social order, are invaluable. The dangerous question this raises is, are we willing to abandon the comfortable but false narratives and embrace reality, however disconcerting it may initially seem?